Thank you, Ben, and thank you for the kind invitation to the ACBS Education SIG. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to speak about my PhD research, and which is the topic you can see on screen, how to protect mental health in challenging contexts. Over time, this has become the theme of my PhD, and with the theoretical aims to evaluate the effects and mechanisms of change of process-based CBT. And originally, like most of us, I've started from mindfulness and ACT, and over the years that span into mindfulness, MBS or MBCT span into ACT, and more recently, I will try to make connections how it also makes more sense to reflect on process-based CBT instead of ACT in my own research. But I am arriving to the point where I think, at least in my work, it's helpful to think about the mechanisms of change as a process and move away from the classical hexaflex approach to something more sophisticated, perhaps. Some of these challenges faced in the ACT community have been prevalent now for a few years, about measurements, the theoretical background. And while I continue to love ACT and MBS or MBCT, it just now seems a bit more sensible to look at a process-based CBT approach. And I will try to make these connections and how I arrived to this point of view in my research, how it evolved from MBCT to ACT, and from ACT to now turning slowly towards this process-based CBT approach. I will give you a highlight of the studies I've done and what I'm currently working on. I will try to draw some learning outcomes and kind of main takeaways that I arrived to in my research, with the purpose to give something which is tangible, hopefully, to the audience too. Maybe it's worthwhile to say that I'm not diverging from the ACT principle very far. It's just towards my I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Management Studies, Goldsmiths University of London, and as our department had a lot of interest in ACT research, in particularly in applied and organizational contexts, we and myself, I face some challenges in the research, and I will try to build on these. So let's go to the next one. You're well aware that the American Psychological Association Division 12 lists acceptance and commitment therapy in a, you could say, a prominent position. A lot of the problems seen in the clinical fields are now recommended to be treated with acceptance and commitment therapy as the first line of treatment. Some of these cases are listed here. I myself, I'm not a clinician, but it does make sense to look at these, how the advancement in acceptance and commitment therapy took over the traditional classical CBT field over the years. Worthwhile to highlight that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy seems to be, or continue to be, our only evidence-based effective treatment for recurrent depression. And with that, I think we are ahead of an interesting change towards the clinical psychology field, as well as in psychotherapy, intervention science, and anything that comes with it. And mainly I will talk about the anything and almost everything outside of the clinical parts. In our department at the IMS Goldsmiths, we have a long-lasting tradition to approach psychology by translating the advancements of clinical psychology into non-clinical applied contexts. And namely, this has been done by Paul Flexman, Frank Bond, also in Sweden by Frederick Liefheim, and our former head of department, Joe Lloyd, and other PhD students starting before me, Annie Gascoigne and Rachel Skews. And their work has been largely looking at how we can utilize acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness-based approaches, particularly Paul Flexman's work, at the workplace and in organizations, recently in the healthcare, how we can help doctors and nurses. And there's been early initiative from Kel Bond and Flexman to develop mental health promotion and ill health prevention strategy in schools for students. This was early, really well coordinated attempt, controlled for a lot of variables as covariates, but this was not yet fully an ACT approach. It was somewhere between the classical CBT and aiming towards, you can, if you read the paper, you can notice the attempts towards acceptance and commitment therapy. And since then, mainly since the release of the Handbook of Contextual Behavioral Science, I believe, done by Dixon and Szabo on the educational utility of ACT in schools, was where this form of research has to help students in schools or adolescents has really kicked off. And I should also mention the recent book released on ACT for Kids and ACT for Adolescents. And so there's a lot of ongoing initiative in the field, of which I have been excited to be part of as in two RCTs that I've carried out at the IMS Goldsmiths alongside with Juanjo Macias, who is my colleague from University of Malaga and was a student with alongside with me completing or doing my PhD under Frank Bond. And during this time at Goldsmiths, I've undertaken various consultancy projects, and I will also talk about this. Part of this have ventured outside the cornerstones of education and looked at sports, particularly using mindfulness-based leadership trainings. I looked at different exciting groups with astronauts and flight controllers of the astronauts participating in so-called space analog Mars desert-like research stations, and then also had the chance to work with actual flight controllers of the International Space Station. And more recently, I looked into how COVID impacted our mental health, and with the works done in these previous interventions, I developed a better understanding, or I believe I developed a better understanding how different psychological processes underlie mental health and productivity, our ability to be resilient under stressful contexts. And I try to aim to study this in a more recent COVID lockdown quarantine study. So I will talk about these studies, and I will also highlight some of the elements of my research which I thought were very helpful to me to approach these contexts. My motivation was to develop interventions that can be used to improve general mental health under challenging conditions. And this to me is an exciting opportunity, because most of the time we just collect survey-based data from students cross-sectionally, and then believe that data to be representative of their mental health under whatever condition. But I took the approach in all my studies here that I tried to study these populations in a situation when they're going under some form of significant challenge. So, for example, people undergoing waves of isolation, confinement, and quarantine during the COVID-19 pandemic, I looked at how they are coping with these with the lockdown itself and being isolated. With this, in the student study, I looked at how students undertaking final A-level exams cope with the highly stressful situation of needing to attend to these exams. And perhaps if we all remember back, a highly stressful period of our life, a lot of expectations towards us. So I guess it's a test of a lifetime at that age. And then I also looked at premier athletes preparing to compete at the London Paralympics, Olympics, either Hungarian or British athletes, judokas or sport shooters, and on the British Paralympic side with the table tennis team, Paralympic team of the UK. With the astronauts who live and work in isolated, confined environments of a habitat which is meant to mimic the future challenges of Mars and the way how people live in these contexts. And I also worked with the flight controllers about to launch an astronaut to the International Space Station while their job design was undergoing, and the responsibilities they had to take for the astronaut and the launch of the astronaut has significantly increased, if not doubled. So one can, I guess, empathize or how these challenges in each of these populations impact everybody's life circumstances and stress and potentially mental health in a particular moment of time. And I believe this challenge as a contextual element is an important functional add-on to the approach I'm taking in these studies. I unfortunately didn't control for each of them, and it's difficult to grasp in some situations. But for example, with the lockdown, it's fairly easy to measure the number of days spent in lockdown, the amount of surface they were they had while undertaking the quarantine, the number of people they were locked up with, the degree of isolation and loneliness they experienced during this. So there are various ways also in the, for example, Mars analog space stations to control for these. I must highlight that with the exception of the COVID study, I worked with very low sample sizes. I had to work with relatively low sample sizes. With the school study, I had a reasonable 230 students, but with the Olympic, Paralympic athletes, analog astronauts, and flight controllers of the space station, you can imagine there are only a handful of people available within Europe or globally to do these or carry out these tasks. 9 flight controllers with the Mars analog astronauts, somewhere between, I think, 29 or 30 people with the Paralympic, Olympic teams, about also 30 some people. So I would rather intend to look at these as pilot studies. So just to highlight, bottom line, I treat the real life and contextual difficulties these individuals face in these various applied contexts as an important element of my research. And on the other side, and this is the journey part of my PhD, that my research in psychology happens to coincide with an emerging mental health crisis, potential mental health crisis, and also a paradigm shift in CBT. So this I realized as I was working on my studies and with real life events taking place, and I think this also is an important part of the story and research. So there's not a consensus. There's not a clear consensus if there's an ongoing mental health decline in global mental health or not, but there are very strong forecasts from the WHO that we can, for example, expect just unipolar depression to be the leading burden of disease economically and socially, accounting for about, if I remember correctly, somewhere about 8.3 trillion of US dollars. So just in the US, it's an incredible amount, very difficult to even comprehend. And this is excluding all the other mental health problems. And on top, the WHO thinks about addiction as a separate problem. So these are all, especially unipolar depression itself seems to be undertaking typical heart and different cardiovascular disorders in the burden of disease. And in a more recent paper, when the pandemic has begun, we wrote about the potential of this mental health, the actual COVID-19 pandemic also contributing the emergence of an actual mental health, not just endemic, pandemic, so global crisis, mental health crisis, and we recommended mindfulness-based interventions for various reasons, which I'm also listing below in the next paragraph as a first line of, or some sort of possibility of intervention and the foundation stones of these interventions. Mainly mindfulness is and also in their earlier report, the WHO in 2011 calls for the development of evidence-based, individually tailored, accessible, context-based or real-life-based interventions, which are relatively cheap, easy to learn, and where the outcome effects are possibly sustainable over time. In terms of intervention science, we are doing pretty badly of long-lasting effect sizes, and we really need to put a lot of work into how we can make the effects of the whatever intervention we are delivering a lasting effect. And then the intervention implemented to a wide range of people needs to be applicable to multiple psychopathologies. In other words, we know the expression transdiagnostic. It has to be easy to learn by the therapist, so it can be delivered and taught relatively easily to the client, who can then self-practice it. Potentially can be taught not individually to the wide audiences for prevention and promotion purposes, but to groups. And this is to prevent the emerging, the worsening of the global mental health conditions. So you can only guess how important it is that we develop feasible strategies in the educational sector, not just for students, but potentially teachers. For example, it's worthwhile to highlight that I will talk about the sport, the Olympic study, Paralympic study we've done, but there we only worked with the coaches. We never worked with the actual athletes yet. The athletes also experienced an improvement in mental health and productivity. Their world ranking improved, and their mental health improved. So we can hypothesize that something similar could take place if we target teachers. Then we also improve the mental health of students indirectly. In my case, in the study that I will introduce you, I only targeted the students. It's also very important to highlight that my birth country, Hungary, has a very bad state. The education is in a very bad state. Teachers are heavily underpaid, ridiculously underpaid, and they are facing a mental health crisis. So obviously they're also missing a lot of classes. We can only imagine how this indirectly impacts students who are in the situation of protesting for them. So if we are to protect mental health of people, citizens of countries, we have to invest into the mental health of the youth, and we have to invest into the mental health and welfare of our teachers. Let that be primary, nursery, kindergarten, primary school, secondary, or college, university, whatsoever. Because it's not just we take care of the mental health of these pupils and individuals, but we also, how to put it, take care of that incredible amount of money falling out as a representation of the burden, mental health burden of diseases. You know, I think we have very little data on how COVID impacted student mental health yet, but it's easy to guess that depression and anxiety and social anxieties and a bunch of other problems, how it impacted students' mental health or teachers. Anyway, let's move towards the second half of the context and background and of my work. There has been a lot of interest in developing and the renaissance of various forms of interventions recently. For example, Paul Wong has been developing so-called PP, the 2.0, positive psychology 2.0 approaches by the use of meaning. I should highlight the work we've done with Nicolette Eisenbach and David Carino of proposing meaning to be an important process to preserve mental health and experience meaning in life. It's not a foreign idea from the ACT framework either, if we look at the values parts. And then we have a strongly emerging and really great community of contemplative science through Mind and Life, where mainly research is focusing on MBSR and MBCT, focusing on different elements of mindfulness, which is also not a foreign idea. If anything, it's really close to the ACT perspective. And then we are well aware of the contextual behavioral advancements in ACT and through psychological flexibility and the parts of it, including values, mindfulness, and all the other elements, where we don't try to change just, you know, where I guess where we are free to change not just one element, but when you focus on one element, you also improve other elements. And theoretically, this is not very heavily underpinned. These things are not heavily researched to what extent values, what extent mindfulness, what extent whatsoever diffusion contribute to psychological flexibility. And we had measurement issues with the AQ2, mainly just heavily overlapping with the psychological inflexibility, which is mainly the AQ2 scale, mainly looking at experiential avoidance. And that heavily overlaps with neuroticism. So this is a challenge I've also faced in my research, because I obviously worked with Frank Bond, and it's been a very prominent measure to use at the time. And some of my research is also collecting data using the AQ2, but now we have more. I must highlight that we have more developed measurements, which new studies should shift towards. And one of these reflections, which also seem to unify all these approaches in terms of framework and the way how we think about intervention science, is process-based CBT, carried out by Hayes and Hoffman, Hayes and Hoffman. But also the need of process-based CBT has been highlighted previously by the WHO in the 2010s, and also by colleagues at King's College London by Stein and Wesley, highlighted the need that we start looking at clinical psychology in a different light. So somehow the picture seems to fall in line, at least to me, somehow seems to be a definite need to unify these approaches and shift from just a rigid approach to psychology and clinical diagnostics of enforcing the diagnostics on someone, but see how the fundamental underlying psychological processes underline these disorders, because by addressing these, it's also not a foreign idea to acceptance and commitment therapy, but by addressing these fundamental psychological processes, we are able to improve mental health and productivity. This doesn't take the credit away from acceptance and commitment therapy or other mindfulness-based intervention like MBSR, MBCT, or even DBT whatsoever. If anything, I think it gives a better framework for us to think about psychology. And while it doesn't abolish the actual interventions already established and the research done on them, it provides a better framework. It kind of exchanges the acronym therapies into a standardized multi-layered system, which can be potentially suitable for a wider variety of people, where we can better individualize mental health care, and using also just my own, but Professor Wesley's words, shift psychology and intervention science into precision psychology. This is really important, and the future of psychology seems to be lying in the hands of process-based CBT or other process-based therapies. But I think there comes the moment where this differentiation between CBT and other therapies become unnecessary with the use of the process-based framework. Right. So I've already mentioned how some of the process-based approaches address limitations of other meaning or mindfulness-based therapies or psychology flexibility-based therapies. We can also think about process-based therapy as bringing psychology behind not just the clinical parts, but also to non-clinical prevention science. And this is fundamental to my work as an applied psychologist working with primarily non-clinical populations. Here I listed a couple of example hypotheses. Mainly I use, because of the small sample sizes, I'm constricted to use either ANOVAs or regressions, sometimes non-parametric regressions. With the larger samples, like perhaps the school study, or definitely with the COVID study, I'm able to use mediation or moderation models. And this is also to say that the data we collected during COVID-19 is just not cross-sectional, but it's a longitudinal study. So we have collected data from people throughout the year during COVID from, I don't know, something like 4,000 people. And yeah, I will highlight here on this. It's also an important part of the study that we wanted to see how trait mindfulness is a predictor of good mental health or better mental health than those who have lower scores in trait mindfulness. And to collect data on trait mindfulness, we used the FMI, the Freiburg Mindfulness Inventory, which is suitable for people who are non-mindfulness practitioners too. And we basically have an roughly equal number of meditation naive and experienced meditation practitioners of these amounts of people. Roughly that equals to 750, 760 people in both groups. The total useful amount of data is 2,500 respondents, and depending on how we work with the mediation analysis. At this stage, we can use about 100 and 1,500 people. For each analysis, I intend to improve my skills. I guess this is also an shout to colleagues if who are knowledgeable in structural equation modeling, and so that we intend to analyze the longitudinal data with that approach. I'm far from an expert in statistics, so my account here can be needs some improvement still. And I'm just trying to see if I'm mentioning, so maybe an important contextual element, we collected data during the between the first and third lockdowns. I mean, altogether we had roughly 4 internationally waves of lockdown, give and take one, depending on which country you're from. And we controlled for things like the number of how heavy people experience the lockdown to be, the length of lockdown, the space they had to spend their lockdowns in, whether they were allowed to visit parks or public spaces, go for a run, leave their homes, whatsoever. The early theory paper is available here. Antonov, myself, Pandey, and Kumari, 2021. Oops, I think this have slid into here. Oh no, I just pressed the wrong side. So this is one of the examples of the mediation models we use here. We are looking at trait mindfulness impacting scores, unified DAS scores, depression, anxiety, stress. We were courageous enough to use it as a unified score because we found significant results in all cases of whether it was studied, whether depression, anxiety, or stress was studied separately or analyzed separately. So we use a unified score here, and we looked at how the brief coping inventories, avoidance coping strategy mediated this relationship. We are now complicating this model, also including other coping styles, and in the long run, we will include other processes like meaning and psychological flexibility, or a set of psychological flexibility, for example, experiential avoidance. For the group, for the Education SIG of ACBS, these two studies, these three upcoming slides, is the focal point. I believe we developed, and study 2 I developed, co-developed with Juanjo Macias protocol. You can see it on the right. This is also available in the study we published here under Macias Bond, Blanca and Valero Aguyo. So you can read it in detail. It's an open access journal, and we collected data from Hungarian and Spanish students, 230 of them, roughly equal sample sizes. And this is an important contextual element. Just 3 to 4, we began to collect just 3 to 4 weeks before their final A-level exams. And we delivered a really, you can say, condensed ACT training, where just a few weeks before the final exam periods, lasting total of 5 hours, 3 sessions, 2 proper training sessions, 1 rehearsal session. And then we were interested with Juanjo Macias how this impacts student mental health, potentially coping styles, rumination, stress, mental health, and some other outcome variables. And we, here you can see the outcome of the Spanish RCT. You can see that women started off from far worse mental health. This is the GHQ-12 score, indicating of high level of distress between them. and something like 10 is already a sign of distress, 12 or 13 is already a sign of significant stress and not very good health or mental health outcomes in the long run. You can see how a score of 20, or in the case of boys, 15 is a pretty bad score. This is just a pre-post measurement. We had really low turnout rate for the follow-up on the day of the graduation. Not a lot of students were interested to complete their studies. I'm working on an analysis where we try to unify the two samples so we can make some relatively meaningful conclusion. Anyway, you can see that girls or females improved far more from the intervention, and roughly to the same level underneath of the cutting edge score of 10 on the GHQ score, indicating distress. And boys tended to benefit less, but they also were in a better shape somehow in terms of distress. And you can see here some of the life satisfaction scores. We had a mild improvement of psychological inflexibility. You can question if this is a reliable finding, because what can you, I mean, if you look at this data collection in real life, we collect it on the day of the treatment before any randomization. And then this is the pre-test, but then we collect the post-test after the end of the training day, which is not very appropriate, but we didn't really have better means to reach these students. And then we tried to collect the follow-up data on the graduation day, which can be somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks, even 4 weeks of post-treatment. So you have all the rights to question the outcome of this data, and this is an important thing for me to highlight. You can see in some cases, some improvements in trait mindfulness scores here. Here, it's not a big magnitude. Also, please remember that we only had a 5-hour-long training, so it's really short. This is half as short as what Bond, Flaxman, and Cow were doing, or in the early 2006 study, or half as short what Joe Lloyd and Paul Flaxman were doing in their more recent study. Also, they, to my knowledge, but to let me know if I'm wrong, they didn't do this in a difficult situation exactly a few weeks before the final exam. So I think these are important takeaways in terms of the applied psychological elements. Now here you have, sorry, Ben, I'm shouting out to see how am I doing with time. I think I've been talking for a while.
Probably like 15 minutes left of the official hour. So if you questions from us,
okay. Apologies. I'll reflect on this the Hungarian sample, and then I just rush through the last few slides to give a brief overview of the remaining 2 studies, and then we can go to questions. If that's still okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. This is the Hungarian sample. You can see that girls were in similarly bad state. They had a slightly smaller effect of mental health improvement, and boys didn't have that improvement in the Hungarian sample as girls in the Spanish, as boys in the Spanish sample. It's a quick reminder. It's interesting. There can be so many reasons for this. It could be cultural differences, how boys relate to mental health promotion strategies in Hungary. There could be the schools we selected, maybe being a bit less, or like the Spanish sample. I believe we all had grammar schools, and in this one we had quite a few vocational schools. So we don't know how these would impact the outcome. There could be just simply cultural barriers to this. It could be also that the Hungarian team was trained by myself. The Spanish was trained by Juanjo Macias, who is a really well-established ACT practitioner and therapist with a lot of experience. So there can be all these confounding variables, and future studies should look at the level of training of the therapist, the cultural differences, individual differences of schools whatsoever. But bear in mind that it's difficult to access and carve out this data from students in such a context of a few weeks before their final exams, and introducing all these covariates will decrease our chances of finding meaningful and valid results. Anyway, study 3, this is a quick overview of the, particularly of the Paralympic, UK Paralympic table tennis team. One important motto of this study was find your breath. This was one way how the coaches were communicating, being grounded or becoming grounded for their athletes. This was a very also exciting projects to work on, where we trained the trainers. We used this train the trainers approach after Paul Flaxman, and we never worked with the athletes, but yet they also showed some improvements of mental health and improvements on world rankings across a year of working with them, just across 4 sessions of training the coaches for, I don't know, half a day, full day, half a day, 6 hours a day kind of training with them to improve transformational leadership styles and reduce kind of passive avoidant, laissez-faire approach to leadership. This study was really exciting to me, working with the also the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, Hanksville, where astronauts work isolatedly, and then we were further able to carry this study into working with the Austrian Space Forum, who are now seen as one of the best space analog research communities, groups, facilities across the world. This is a wonderful picture from the BBC headlines of 2 astronauts working together. And this study was funded by the ACPS Research Development Grant of 2017 and 18. Also alongside with this study, where I had the rare opportunity to work with the flight controllers of the International Space Station preparing to launch an astronaut. You can see our objectives here, and unfortunately I've removed the outcomes, but these are mainly qualitative in nature, and we have some traces of improved mental health and team cohesion. From this study, very difficult to drain or take data out of just very rare and highly trained participants in the world. Overall findings of my PhD so far, I'm consistently finding improvements in mental health following improving and well-being, improving psychological processes, whether I'm looking at decreasing experiential avoidance, and this is how I suggest people to look at the AQ2 scores, or improving trait mindfulness, or improving perceived meaning in life, values, and so on. This led to these were then seen as processes, underlying processes of in my research, which also in the sports study, for example, led to transformational leadership improvement in performance. In the space studies, it improved to job design control and team cohesion, and also improved mental health. this raises a lot of questions that I believe we don't really have time to go into now, maybe on a different talk. And then I think the key important learning outcome, looking at process-based ACT or mindfulness or process-based CBT as a trainer or therapist or a researcher, is that these forms of process-based therapy, they're not only transdiagnostic, meaning we can use it not only for multiple, to reduce symptomology of multiple mental health disorders, but, and this is a term introduced by Grisson 2016, also trans-therapeutic, in an early mindfulness paper by 2016 of him, if I remember correctly, which I would like to introduce to the ACT community too. We can also use it for generally improving a lot of important critical outcome variables, mental well-being, not on the clinical side, but on the healthily functioning people, between healthily functioning people, well-being, transformational leadership, performance, and all these things listed here. Learning outcomes on the AQ2 side, high performers of groups like these, like the astronauts or flight controllers or premier athletes, they find it very difficult to relate to the AQ2. They would just score basically on very, very low on them, almost on 0 usually, meaning the scale is not sophisticated enough to pick up distress or psychological inflexibility or experiential avoidance between them, or maybe they don't have much. So that was a challenge I had to overcome in my research, and in some cases trait mindfulness seemed to be a better indicator. With this, I guess, with my own research, I'm moving towards a process-based approach rather than a psychological, strictly hexaflex-based psychological flexibility model of human behavior, and RFT and all sorts of other important theories of cognition and language and behavior are just way more meaningful thinking in the process-based context. Also, these interventions equally like ACT or MBIs, because they're already a lot more implementable than classical CBTs. Most cases, they're more effective, they're easier to learn, and they're most suitable for individualized healthcare. And I'm just personally excited where process-based CBT takes us towards probably a very long trip of transforming psychology into a version of process-based medicine. So thank you for your attention. I'm very keen to hear your feedback. I would be very keen to hear from colleagues on how you tackle problems on analyzing very small sample studies, how you analyze pilot studies, unusual samples, what non-parametric tests do you use. I would like to acknowledge and thank ACBS for the development research grant in 2017, allowing me, also give me the credibility to work with the European Space Agency and other agents in the space industry, UK Sports, as well as Goldsmiths for supporting me in my research. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you so much. Really interesting. And looking at my own PhD study, I don't know how on earth you've managed to do 4 completely kind of massive chunks of things to do, where I'm trying to squeeze in just 1.
It was a bad idea because I dragged it too long.
Very
Still dragging
it. Cool, thank you. And lots obviously talk about that messiness of working in education, how even just the study, the data collection at the end has to be pragmatic as possible, because it's such a, well, we know the individuals are so dynamic and contextual, but then when you put 400 of them together in a school, those problems seem to compound massively. Suzanne, have you got any questions? I'll start with you. I've got a few. I thought you'd go to you first if you have.
I don't actually have any questions. I found it really fascinating, so thank you. Especially, I like learning more about transition because I work at the university as a therapist, and for me, it's often my background was a youth worker, so I love the transition and people's mental health and well-being throughout the whole process. Oh, it's quite fascinating. So listening to how you worked in schools, and I would have been curious as to how it would have worked in a British school, but even then, like I live in the countryside in Cornwall, in a tiny little village, very different from if I'd lived in London. So even and I suppose in Hungary, like you were saying about the school types, very different again. That interested me more. I was like, oh, what would happen if you replicated? So
yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I'm never too old to do a PhD, am I? I don't know.
Just don't drag it like I did. Or I'm doing.
It was amazing. But no, I haven't. So, but thank you. It's been brilliant to listen to.
Maybe it's worthwhile to say that few schools in Hungary with Juanjo Macias in Spain are picking up on the intervention, and in the UK we have some interest, and recently in the Middle East we got some interest to train schools or students, or so we would love to see how we can improve and develop and collaborate on this with with other colleagues, and where this leads down. And we hope that, because it's a particular age between kind of adolescence and young adults, so we also think it's translatable to early university years, which is also a very different way of studying than
it is
in secondary school.
I used the DNAV model to in the university, because as far as I'm concerned, they've got so much work to do here. Their minds are full up of words and terminology, and DNAV, you don't need a dictionary. It's simple, it's easy. So yeah, it's my way forward. It works.
Yeah, the DNA model is great, and we hope we would be able to also collaborate with them on this.
How receptive were the students? You know, I'm a secondary teacher by trade, that's me. And I can see some students would love this idea of getting some help in the last few months of their exams, and others, it's just another thing they've got to go through, you know, another workload or whatever. How were the students that you worked with? How receptive were they?
Yeah, good question. I think they were okay. One example that I continue to remember and it stands out, and that was our mistake for not being, or my mistake not being sensitive to those sort of cultural, or you could say religious differences. One student, you have to say something, what is this about? And you try to sell it to students, but it's not a really good idea to mention that mindfulness was secularized and derived from Buddhism, because in Christian communities, this, for example, he was very keen to attend, but at the end of the first session, he said that, I'm sorry, but my religion and my personal beliefs don't allow me to participate. So another reason why I think it's worthwhile to kind of drop these traditional roots and really just look at processes. And of course, mindfulness has also its Christian contemplative roots, but as most Christian people are not even aware of that, they're more related to the regular church-based. So we really need to look into how these impact. And I think, and maybe another thing that I recall, I think they were okay with it, and I was particularly thankful for Juanjo Macias finding this wonderful video, and I can only recommend, called Falling Floyd. it's a cartoon of a heartbroken guy who's earns his pocket money playing the trumpet, and then tries to propose. He gets rejected. Figures out it didn't exactly go how he thought about it, his relationship, and then, you know, he starts to build up this massive angst and anger on his shoulders, which is depicted by this black monster on his shoulders. And it's very, you know, approachable story, and how this monster grows on him and drains him and pushes him to alcoholism, or even when he sees all those people trying different kind of forms of other addictions around him, and he really plunges into this deep realm. And then how he starts, and the story is really kind, depicting how you can make friends with your monsters. You can accept your monsters, your demons, and how he finds back life and joy to playing the trumpet and being himself again. And I think this was really relatable for our students, and better explained as we could. We used a lot of metaphors to make it relatable. Some were a bit simple, or simple in a way that, or simplified, or just, I don't know, some samurai who is annoyed by a fly flying on him, and then he cannot meditate, he cannot contemplate, he cannot focus, so he tries to slice up this fly. But, you know, as he slices up the flies divide, and just there's even more hustle. And one way really to ease up or ease down his mind is just to focus, and that's trying to show students how it is important to notice their private experiences, not on a personal way, just to notice how it comes to them and what it means to them, but maybe not taking it so personally.
Yeah, and Tom Szabo, when he did his seminar 2 months ago, he was really emphasizing the use of metaphor, and not just giving them the metaphors and saying, can we consider this, but you get them to tell me, what does that look like, and they come up with this kind of metaphor to play with. And then it's that playful approach with working with these students as well. That's interesting.
That would be great. It's and we've tried to achieve some of that, but because you work in a group, sometimes in 20-30 people, maybe 40, all lured into one classroom, it's difficult to, even if you have an assistant trainer with you in the Kun, it's difficult to have that level of engagement.
I think that might be easier perhaps in a university setting, where people are there very focused on what they're doing. So in a school where there's so many different people, I mean, I work at a university where we've got 2 universities on one campus. So you could be studying medicine and history and science, or you could be studying game art, right? So if I'm working with a group of game art students, and I bring forward a metaphor, I could say, give me a metaphor. And they could create these metaphors that would probably be about superhero things. But a medical student would be maybe going, well, it's an Excel spreadsheet. But there's something that they would be able to do in their own way. And I think getting the student to help create their own metaphors can be much more amazing once they start it.
And I'm curious to ask back, because university is already young adults. These are almost young adults we've worked with. But early intervention should be our primary focus, because, you know, not everybody gets to university. How do we help those? And how so these are all really big questions to
It's
me.
where I want a new job, please. Honestly, I mean it. I've got a 10-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy, and I see them and I think, oh, the primary school that my kids went to was brilliant, and they really went for it, and they do all sorts. The secondary school, There's so much they could do. In my last job, I would be in secondary schools doing stress awareness workshops, and the funding went for that, which was such a shame. It's pretty similar to what they do now, but in, I think, is it ACT does Connect, something like that. I can't remember.
Connected.
Yeah, I can't remember. But there's something that needs to be done as a preventative measure, or actually not even preventative, as a boost right from the beginning. So it's not thought of as preventative, it's thought of as, I am boosting myself. This is a building of who I am. So when I offer group sessions, I tend to not offer them as prevention or anything like that. I offer them as personal enhancement courses that will get a certificate. So they can put that on their CV.
That's actually awesome.
That's
a really good idea.
Yeah.
Getting it into the water is what Duncan Gillett says a lot about, how to get access to the water. And the big thing that was,
isn't it? Yeah.
The post recently was, but then how do you help those who don't want to be helped or don't know that they need to be helped or anything like that? That's the big kind of Steve Hayes said it. We know it works. ACT works if you want it. If you come to us and you sign and you opt in, but how do we get that public health approach where everyone's kind of, it's in the water?
Do you think in a classroom, people listen, even if they don't interact, it goes in, even if one sentence is in there? So I know when I've worked before, you get some that really interact and really get involved, and you get the ones that look at you really scathingly, like you're an idiot. But they are hearing what you're saying. So if you're asking them, what their values are, what their, what matters to them, they may not answer you at all. They might look at you and like, I don't care.
Yeah.
But they will go home and that question has been asked.
Yeah.
They'll go home and their mum will say, God said you can't do that. And they might think, I don't believe in the God. Sorry if you're religious. They might be questioning for themselves. Do I believe there's a God? Do I not? I don't know. Ooh. And the question of their own core values could be starting. You'll have started something without even them knowing. That's the power, the magic of teaching, I think. So you're in a school, I'm like, wow, you're amazing. You have a power that you use without even knowing it.
And that part of the training, like obviously at the minute, my project's on getting ACT into the water supply by having it as preventative. I focus on maths anxiety and maths resilience. So it's very important, but the plan is to broaden it out. But yeah, that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? To teach in ways which don't get into such a state. I think a lot we talk about, and going back to what Carol was saying about, you're doing a study here, aren't you, as well, Carol? You're doing, you have a protocol you need to follow. It's hard to be as flexible and adaptive when you need something, validity and reliability and stuff like that, and you've got statistics to come in afterwards. Do you think that, you said it was 5 hours, didn't you? Protocol?
Yes, 5 plus the data collection.
That's obviously
give and take 10,
yeah.
10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, significantly less than all the other ones you say, and the top ones. Do you think that's an appropriate amount? Do you think that's enough? Do you think you could do it in less time? Because obviously in schools we're always pushing to get our bang for the buck, but that's a limit to that. You don't want to do a 20-minute session and then leave them. But what do you think about that 5-hour number?
Good question. I don't have the correct answer, and I think we will take years to research that, what the correct number is. I think somewhere between that 5 to 10. I think because for the third session, we only really just rehearsed in the last hour what we did. So if you really, and some students didn't get to attend all the trainings. So we only included students who attended at least 2, I think. Need to double check, but and the results are relatively big for this kind of short and on-spot intervention. We have to think about how real the results are and how lasting they are. But considering that in a week or 2 they're going into that final exam, think that's robust. But again, it would be great if we could collaborate with the school psychologists and say that, oh, look, this student, he didn't respond well, as in we didn't see any change in the scores, and the scores are still low in terms of mental health, so, or high in terms of mental ill health, indicating distress. So what can we do about it? And there must be some sort of fusion between what we try to offer, and maybe to be honest, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the DNA approach, but I'm sure there are places for both interventions, or because it's different to help on the spot when stress is actually happening, and different to prevent. And what does that tell us? How to help people? And so there's a lot of questions in my mind, and I would hope that farther down the line there's a nice research grant where we can all collaborate and you know, work between schools and maybe internationally, and join all these endeavors, because fundamentally it's also, DNA is also an ACT approach. The other approach is also ACT or process-based approaches. It's just a matter of how we look at it and the names. We can sophisticate the theory as a concept, but at the end, the main outcome variable is mental health and productivity, and how much I am seeing myself as an authentic human being. How well can I collect with my classmates? So if we, you know, whatever we process, we study, it's about the outcome variable, really. As researchers, we have to give account how and how the intervention works, but if it works, then we've got something important going on.